Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Karl Cassell. I'll be your moderator today, President and CEO of Horizons of Family Service Alliance. During the 2008 presidential campaign, Iowa was proud to boast that it was the start of the road to the White House for current President Barack Obama. The crowds and excitement surrounding the shift in American politics seemed to be bringing young and old alike into what we would consider American democracy. Now, just 8 years later, Iowa has seemed to shift yet again, and in almost the same way has pushed President-elect Donald J. Trump to the White House. Today on Ethical Perspectives on the News, we will discuss with the three panelists to my left the 2016 election, why Iowa voted as it did, and how this recent phenomena potentially could affect our state. To my immediate left, we have Jesse Case, Principal Officer for Teamsters Local 238. Good morning.
Morning.
In the middle, Tim Hagle, Professor of Political Science, University of Iowa. Good morning. And on the end, Lyle Muller, Iowa Center for Public Affairs and Journalism, Iowa Watch. Good morning.
Good morning, Karl.
So Obama won the state by 6 points in 2012, by nearly 10 in 2008. George W. Bush barely won our state in 2004 and barely lost it in 2000. What's more, Trump lost the state's caucus to Ted Cruz in February, but in this election he won 93 out of 99 counties. What is going on in the state of Iowa? Is this just a phenomenon?
Well, you know, when you ask the question, just a phenomenon, some phenomena are pretty impressive. Yes. I was thinking about, you said, ask the dinosaurs about the phenomena of the meteor that hit. I don't know that this is necessarily a meteor that hit, but I think what this election and the changes that you indicated going from Bush to Obama, and then now to Trump, what you're really seeing is the importance of the balance in this state and the importance of the no-party voters, the independents in the state. That we can be pretty sure that reliably the Democrats and Republicans have pretty similar turnout in terms of presidential elections in particular, but it's those no-party voters, and particularly the ones that come out only in presidential elections, that really decide this state. And this time, at least, they went more heavily for Donald Trump.
I know of people who voted for Barack Obama, voted for Ralph Nader, voted for Donald Trump, voted for Ronald Reagan. That's a pretty wide band. But what I've noticed in the years that I've been reporting in politics and other areas of news is the independence of Iowans, where they really like to make their own minds up. After Donald Trump was elected, I got an email from a longtime friend who said, I want to tell you why I voted for Donald Trump. It's because I'm sick and tired of being told what to do, what I should think. And he cited some examples that you could argue with, such as public opinion polls and whether or not they tell you what to think or they just reflect what people are telling pollsters, which is what I believe they do. But there was this type of attitude that existed in this election that we usually see in other elections too. It's just that the candidates who are running for president seem to be more traditional than one of them was this year.
Yeah, I'm not surprised at the election, actually. I mean, I was a little in shock on election night, but I think people are tired of the status quo. It's not working for them. In Iowa alone, there are $600 million in wage theft every year, and we have one wage theft investigator. $600 million. That means money's not going into unemployment, money's not going into work comp. The minimum wage hasn't been raised in 8 years. So status quo isn't working for low-income people either. And you know, people voted for a change in the status quo, but I'm not sure they understand what change they're going to get. You know, the Iowa legislature is talking about raising premiums for firefighters and cops, and we're the largest union of law enforcement in the state. So they're talking about you know, increasing cost to families for people who are first responders. I don't think people knew that they were voting for that. The governor's talking about privatizing IPERS. I don't think people knew they were voting for that. I think people wanted a change, but I think they're going to be surprised by the change that this current legislature tries to give them.
And let me piggyback on both of those comments. So you talked about you guys talked about independent voters, Democrat and Republicans, status quo. Will we start seeing maybe a shift away from people claiming their parties in elections, or will there be more folks to go to maybe the independent party, or in the next 2 and 4 year elections, will we see kind of a balance? Will it remain the same? What are your thoughts?
I'll go first here. I hope people look at different options, and the two-party system is the system we live under, but that's the election was kind of a referendum on that two-party system. You take counties like Buena Vista County in Iowa, northwest Iowa, where a Democrat can't get elected. It's Steve King country, but yet you have a large Latino population who is not plugged into the electoral process. That might be a good place where an independent or non-major party candidate could run. So I think everything should be on the table. We should be reevaluating our whole political structure. You know, we've cut mental health services. We've cut all kinds of services. We're looking at more cuts, and we really have to start looking at what we're going to do on a community level, including running alternative candidates.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question exactly, because Iowa traditionally has been about 1/3 Democrat, 1/3 Republican, 1/3 independent, give or take a few percentage points here and there in given election cycles. And I don't know that that's going to change. Perhaps there's some comfort in the independent status because of the inability to have a third party. One of the things I've wondered, and I'd be interested in what people in your field, Tim, think about this, is whether or not this year was really a victory for libertarianism. Because some of the things that Donald Trump was saying those things were not traditionally Republican stances, but they were more towards libertarian stances. And there was an ability to get that into the White House without having to go through this whole ordeal of having the Libertarian Party trying to be as strong as it wish it was.
You know, that's one of the things that is interesting. Well, many things are interesting about what happened, and we're going to have to just wait and see what happens. But you're right that Donald Trump is an unknown in many respects, that many conservatives didn't like him because they didn't think he was conservative. The Democrats and Hillary Clinton's campaign tried to portray him as being ultra-conservative and attaching him to some of the people that were supporting Trump. But the thing is we really don't know. And what Trump's claim to fame is that he's a deal maker. And so he might be able to reach out more to some other groups, whether you think of it as a libertarian sort of situation, or whoever it happens to be, or maybe you don't want to put a political label on it. So in that sense, it may be an opportunity for libertarians to step up a little bit. And they had that chance to some extent in this election, but unfortunately, Gary Johnson, who was a libertarian candidate, really wasn't the person that was the standard bearer that they needed. They needed somebody else that was more charismatic, that was more in tune, I think, with the current thinking, to be that option for both the people that maybe didn't like Trump and didn't like Hillary Clinton either, and they really couldn't say, well, I'm going to pull the trigger for Johnson. A few went to McMullen, a few went to Stein, so there was sort of that rumbling, but I think a lot of people basically held their nose to a certain extent and picked one of the two, Trump or Clinton, that they disliked the least and went with that. Back on the Iowa question, you were talking about some of the very specific policy things. I think in general voter registration, we have seen kind of an up and down pattern where it was, when I started looking at the voter registration from about 2000 on, and at that point in 2000, it was pretty even. Republicans had a bit of a lead, and then in 2008, there was a huge surge for Democrats with Obama in the caucuses, a lot of interest there. And then it's tapered off, and Republicans have been ascendant to a certain extent. But the latest voter registration figures show the no-party people making a huge gain based on voter registration on Election Day. And so I think that we're still going to see that the no-party voters are the ones that are really going to be driving the bus to the extent that they're willing to participate in the process. And that was part of the problem, is a lot of times they aren't interested in participating. And some of the issues that you mentioned are the things that are going to get them out to the polls.
I agree. And I think people are going to have buyer's remorse to a certain extent. Trump's Commerce Secretary, owns a factory in Iowa City. He's laying off 400 people. This is the guy who's in charge of the United States economy, laying off 400 Iowans. A lot of those people voted for Trump. But I think, we have to look at, the issues that are facing working families in Iowa. And when people go home from work, they have mental health illness in their house. They're dealing with chronic pain in their household. They're dealing with diabetes. They're dealing with smoking cessation, and almost every issue facing working families, and the scientific research kind of backs up that they're all socioeconomic issues. The less money you make, the fewer advocates you have, and the fewer access to services you have. So we're going to have to start figuring some of these issues out as a community, and not wait for Des Moines to do it, not wait for DC to do it, and start partnering with untraditional allies, but we also have to hold the legislature accountable. It's not acceptable to cut mental health. It's not acceptable to raise health care premiums for nurses who are taking care of our family members. It's not okay to raise health care premiums for teachers who are already digging into their pockets to buy school supplies for their students. So we have to hold the legislature accountable this session, but we also have to be looking at what can we do to address the issues of working families in the homes and in the neighborhoods.
So let me ask a question that deals with middle-class Iowans. How significant is the Republican control of the House and Senate in Iowa, and will it have a dramatic effect one way or the other on middle-class Americans?
It's going to have a dramatic effect if Iowans let them do what they want to do. Like I said, they're going after the ability for public servants in this state to have a voice on the job by attacking collective bargaining. And we represent 6,000 Iowans, our local union does, in every sector. About 45% of them are public sector. The rest of them are in the private sector. So if the agenda of the current legislature is to take away collective bargaining rights for cops and firefighters and teachers and nurses, that's going to have a direct impact on our communities and our schools and our hospitals. And there's such a nursing shortage in Iowa right now. If you take away benefits and take away the incentive to go into that field, our nursing shortage is going to be compounded. If we erode benefits for firefighters, it's going to be harder to recruit firefighters and police officers. I think nurses and police officers and firefighters know what they need to do their job better than the elected officials in Des Moines.
It's going to be huge because a 2-vote margin has kept a lot of legislation from moving forward in the State House, and that 2-vote margin was what the Democrats had in the Senate until this coming January. And now with the Republicans in charge of both houses and the State House, you're going to see some bills that Republicans have wanted to get through but have been running into a roadblock with the Democratic Party in the Senate. For example, whether or not the holders of gun permits ought to be kept secret and not a public record. That's an issue. Speaking of the Second Amendment, there's a lot of support amongst Republicans for just having a Second Amendment rights bill in Iowa so that you wouldn't have to have any kind of permits. And those are the types of things that have been pent up for Republicans that they feel they haven't been able to get a voice for with the Democrats. Moreover, you have issues coming up with dealing with public employees, whether or not public employees, particularly supervisors or people in positions of authority, when they're fired, whether or not the reasons for their firing should be made public. The Democrats in the Senate have blocked that. Governor Branstad always says, I would love to have that as a law, but the Democrats keep blocking it. Well, the Democrats aren't there to block it anymore. I think what you will see will be fights between the State House at the legislature and the governor's office, because there will be disagreement with things that the governor wants that the Republicans in the House and the Senate would like. That'll be the interesting fight, and that has happened before as well in Iowa.
Yeah, I think along those lines that to a certain extent we have to wait and see what's going to happen, because sometimes when you have that sort of roadblock like we had before, where the Democrats controlled the Senate and Republicans controlled the governor's office, but also the State House, that there's a lot of talk, but they know that nothing's going to happen. And now all of a sudden, when you have power, both party controlling both houses, well, will they get the things through that they've been talking about, or are they going to have a second thoughts about it? Because they certainly don't want to have a situation where they pass things and then all of a sudden you get, like you said, buyer's remorse, because they're going to be coming up, especially members of the House, in an election in another couple of years. So they may take a second thought about something, or maybe craft something that's not as drastic as what they had talked about on the campaign trail. We just have to wait and see. And then, of course, with the change in the governor's office, that may cause a change in policies too. So it could be bad for certain people in terms of the policies that they want or don't want, but I think that there's also kind of a wait and see approach that you could take and see what they're going to do or what they're able to do.
And they're going to get started with a non-popular problem, and that is $100 million less in revenue than was expected for the budget. That's according to the state's revenue predictions here just recently in December. So that's not going to be a fun issue to deal with, because they'll be starting right off with something negative, and that is cutting funding, which means cutting services.
So we mentioned Governor Branstad, who will obviously, if approved by Congress, he will become our ambassador to China. Now we know Trump has been hard on China as a country and their fiscal policies and currency manipulation, as he says. Do we believe, based on who our governor is, will he aid in helping bridge that gap and be the sort of ambassador that we Iowans can be proud of?
Well, Governor Branstad has a lot of respect in China, and Chinese newspapers have been writing about him, saying that he's a friend of the country, and they're pleased with this. But also in some of the Chinese newspapers, there have been articles and editorials that say, just because you're a popular messenger doesn't mean we're going to like the message. And so Governor Branstad is going to have quite a task. He's going to have to shift into diplomacy, where he will have to be the person who's responsible for bridging the gap between what is going on in China and what China wants to accomplish and what the American policy is. And in particular, a policy in which we still are seeing the president-elect saying things sometimes off the cuff and other times being very steadfast about a policy. So that's going to be a difficult task for Governor Branstad. My personal belief is that the appointment of him is a smart move because of his relationship with President Xi, and also because Governor Branstad already has business contacts there, and this administration coming in is going to be all about business deals.
Yeah, I think that Ambassador Branstad's job is to carry out the agenda of President Trump.
Exactly.
Regardless of his relationships, regardless of his personal politics, he's there at the appointment of the president. Mm-hmm. And so it all comes back to Trump's agenda with China or his own businesses. So I think it's yet to be determined what happens with China. But kind of pivoting back to Iowa, I think the Democrats have to, or the Republicans, I'm sorry, have to be careful about overplaying their hand here. There's really no checks and balances either in D.C. or in Iowa right now, where you have full control of all three branches with one party. So I think, if I were in the Republican leadership, I might be, looking at the Branstad agenda prior to him leaving for China versus the Reynolds agenda afterwards. Branstad is a very popular governor, but now he's not going to be governor. And if the Republicans overreach on this agenda with no checks and balances, the voters could come back and bite them in the end on that.
And I'll tie those two things together to a certain extent. As far as the checks and balances, one of the things that we'll start to see now, and we saw this in 2009 and 2010 before the elections, where you had, for the Democrats, had control of both houses of the U.S. Congress and the presidency, and you started to see a little tension between the presidency and Congress. So, of course, we always talk about the politics, Democrat, Republican. We have to remember, of course, that you've got the three branches of government, and although the Supreme Court isn't into it quite the same way the presidency and Congress is, there's a little back and forth there, and we're going to see this both at the U.S. level and the state level, in the sense that what people in the Iowa legislature want may not be the same thing what Iowa in the governor's office want. And so that's where we're going to see a little bit of a tension there. As far as Governor Branstad being the ambassador, I think that you're right, that he's going to be carrying through on President Trump's policies, but having that relationship in China and having that respect gives him a foundation on which he can build, hopefully, to carry a message which may not always be pleasant for the Chinese, but do it in a way that can keep that relation, keep that dialogue going.
Well, you can tell someone you're going to burn down their house as nice as you want to, but if the message that comes out of the Trump administration is what he said on the campaign trail, where it's almost an anti-diplomacy message, you can have the best diplomat as your ambassador, but if you're carrying the wrong message, it's you know, I don't know if you can sweet talk enough of your way through that.
One thing I would say on that, and this is something that Hillary Clinton mentioned on the campaign trail and got criticized for it in an odd way, that you have a public face and a private face, or a public voice and a private voice. And we kind of know that to be true, and yet somehow she got criticized for it. And I think that that's, to a certain extent, what Trump's approach is, that he has a very public, very occasionally offensive or obnoxious, or however you want to characterize it, approach to things, and yet when you get down to the negotiating part of it, that art of the deals kind of thing, that he's then backs off, and it's a subtler message. Now we have to see if that's what happens in terms of actually his relationships with these countries.
That's also called
We'll have to
lying.
wait and see.
I mean, we negotiate 300 contracts in our local, and if we're saying one thing on the campaign trail and then get to the bargaining table and say, surprise, we didn't mean it. Our word's everything in bargaining, and I think Trump's going to have a hard time with credibility and voters if he switches on too many issues from, no, that was just me campaigning, versus now I'm governing and I'm going to flip on this and this and this and this. I think at some point people expect our elected officials to carry through with what they said on the campaign trail and not have a different agenda when they get elected.
And that's the challenge that Trump faces, because his way of operating is not what we're expecting. And will we be able to change our expectations? Will he be able to change his approach? Wait and see.
But we are seeing, and you're right, I agree with you, but that voters are going to want to see results, especially if all of a sudden they're being laid off when they thought factory jobs were coming. Right. But we are seeing some post-election polling right now that shows that Trump supporters are willing to give him some slack, that they're willing to give him slack, that, okay, we know you didn't quite mean that. And the Pew Research, Pew Institute is coming out with some research about this. And so that's helping him right now. But I think as time goes on, and especially as the House and Senate find their own way in Washington and pick their agendas and take the pulse of the public and see how things are going with the Trump administration, that could change. But right now, he's getting some slack from his followers because they wanted him. They were more concerned about getting him and getting rid of other people than they were about particular issues.
And I think it goes back to they wanted him because they felt like the issues of working people were being ignored. So just, again, kind of pivoting back to why people voted for him, and the socioeconomic issues that are facing people's families around the dinner table. It's not so much that Hillary's emails. When we go out and talk to our members, nobody's talking about Hillary's emails. They're talking about mental health funding, and they're talking about chronic pain, and they're talking about. So I think people have cut him some slack, but he hasn't even been sworn in yet. So I think it'll be, and I don't know either, but it'll be interesting to see how long people cut him slack before they flip on him.
So, hot button issue over the last year has been Supreme Court nominee. So we know our Senator Grassley, as well as other Republican senators, did not want President Obama to choose our next Supreme Court judge. How big a role will this play for Trump, in your estimation, in terms of picking the next Supreme Court judge? And do we think Iowans will be happy?
I think that whether Iowans or anybody else will be happy obviously depends a lot on who Trump ends up picking. And this gets back to the expectations and the cutting of slack on Trump, is that there are a lot of people that basically prioritize the Supreme Court vacancy, that they thought it was important. I didn't think that it was the highest one. I always said that it was the economics and the concerns for the working families. But for a lot of folks that care about particular issues, whether it's a Second Amendment, whether it's abortion question, and regardless of what side you're on, that basically whatever's going to happen with that vacancy could determine a lot of those Supreme Court decisions. And so who Trump picks will be critically important. And he's put out a list. Whether he sticks to it, he said he's going to stick to it, at least make a pick from that list. Those may be good people, maybe not. We have to look at who he narrows it down to a little bit in terms of how conservative they are on some issues, maybe liberal on some issues too. Are they going to be a mix? Are they going to be more moderate? And those are the kinds of things that will be pretty important when it comes time for him to actually make that selection. So in fact, today I was asked by another person, what's the most critical issue? And I put Supreme Court position at the top, aside from the cabinet choices, because that's the one where somebody could be on the court for 30 years making some pretty critical decisions even in the next few years.
I think there's an expectation of the public now that justices appointed to the Supreme Court are going to adhere to a political point of view. I think it's been politicized a lot. But I think of certain appointments that have bedeviled presidents. Dwight Eisenhower appointing Justice Berger, who presided over a fairly liberal court. And then you have John Kennedy appointing Byron White, who wasn't a liberal justice under the traditional sense, or Gerald Ford, a Republican, appointing John Paul Stevens, who turned out to be liberal. So you get these kind of twists and turns when people get to the Supreme Court. I think John Roberts has bedeviled Republicans on some of his decisions as he's looked at these things. So nothing is certain when you try to appoint a Supreme Court justice unless you really expect, I believe, a politically minded justice and push for something like that. If we get to that, that would be very dangerous.
Any final thoughts?
Well, look, people voted for Trump because they thought D.C. was broken, and part of that broken equation was the people in Congress blocking everything Obama did, including Supreme Court picks, and not giving them a hearing, just unprecedented obstructionism. So it'll be interesting. I mean, at the end of the day, the election's over. The Supreme Court's going to, move forward. Congress will move forward, but it's going to come down to what families are feeling at home and on the job. And I think if we have any expectations that the D.C. is going to be fixed anytime soon, I think we're kidding ourselves.
Well, on that note, we definitely enjoyed the conversation today. There's never enough time to talk about this issue, and we know there'll be many more conversations here in the very near future in the next 4 years. And as you guys have mentioned, only time will tell. None of us are certain how the next 4 years will play out, but we can all be certain this will be different than any other time probably in recent American history. As a nation of diverse people and cultures, we hope that our elected officials would govern in a manner that is in the best interest of the American people. President Trump should pursue those interests that will promote safety, peace, and tranquility. That is the standard in which his term will be evaluated against. We'll watch in anticipation. Thank you and good morning.